Hey, this is Adam Malanga with AdamMalanga.com from Skullbone, Tennessee. And you're listening to the world's #1 pest control training podcast, the Pest Geek Podcast with Frank Hernandez.
This edition of the Pest Geek Podcast is brought to you by Pest Routes. Pest Routes, supercharge your company with Pest Routes, the #1 pest control software to help you dominate your goals. Visit them at pestroutes.com and get your free demo.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek Podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek Podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube, we're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Steven Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, Pest Geek Podcast fans. My name is Steven Van Tassel of the Wildlife Control Consultant. Thanks for listening. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about possums, particularly diseases that are associated with the possums. Now, one of my longtime interests has been zoonotics. That's the study of diseases that come from wildlife and affect humans. And so one of the things that I've always been interested in the last few years, of course, or perhaps I should say shocked, is how cavalier many people in the wildlife control industry are when it comes to wildlife. I mean, their attitude is, my grandfather handled animals and my dad handled animals and I've been involved in handling animals for 20 years and I've never gotten quote unquote sick. And they think they don't need to be wearing gloves. They don't have to be thinking about hygiene. So just like with pest control operators who must always be thinking about the pesticides they're using and the exposure that they could have with that, particularly those chronic low-level types of exposures rather than the acute ones, wildlife control operators also have to be thinking about zoonotic diseases. Now, I'm not suggesting that pest control operators don't have to be thinking about zoonotic diseases. It's just that the difference might be the level of exposure element. So I'm certainly hopeful that if you're involved in pest control, which I would assume many of you as listeners are, that you would also be thinking about what are you exposing yourself when you handle that occasional raccoon or skunk or possum, in that are you really protecting yourself properly? So what I'm doing today is I'm going to talk about opossums and particularly the diseases associated with them. And so the source of my material is actually an article that was published some time ago. Now, don't be dismayed. This was, even though it's a bit dated in the sense that it was published in 1963, the information tells you that these are infections and diseases that possums can in fact carry. So unless you think the possum of today is a fundamentally different beast than 1963, then chances are that the possums of today can carry the same infections. And so it's just something to keep in the back of your mind while you're working with animals or you're working in areas that have been involved with possums. And so you don't have to necessarily be a wildlife control operator to have contact with some of these diseases. Because sometimes there'll be a vector on that possum, like a flea, that can transmit a disease from the possum to you or to someone you love. So the article that I'm using today is written by Thomas R. B. Barr, that's B-A-R-R, and the title of his article was Infectious Diseases in the Opossum, a Review. Now, a review article is something where a researcher goes through all of the other published articles and tries to summarize and systematize the information that he's finding. So it's a way of collecting a vast amount of data and putting it all in one place as he evaluates those publications. So in this sense, think of it like a large funnel. You throw all these articles into a big funnel, and one article pops out at the end. And that's basically what a review article is. So he Barr published this article in the Journal of Wildlife Management. This is a Tier 1 journal article. If you're not familiar with how publications work, well, let me take a little side note here and talk about how publications work. You have peer-reviewed publications. Those are the highest level of scientific work possible. That means the research has been vetted or reviewed by other experts within that particular field. It's the high. It doesn't mean that everything in it's true. It just means that it's gone through a ringer. Having published a couple of articles in peer-reviewed journals, I can tell you that it's like having your paper go through a sieve. And these reviewers sometimes get incredibly nitpicky about things. So if you're not a detail-oriented person, don't write articles for peer-reviewed journals because they will shred you up. That's the highest level. The next level is what's called peer-edited. Now, peer-edited publications are sort of like something like the Vertebrate Pest Conference Proceedings, the Wildlife Damage Management Conference Proceedings, and other conference proceedings. So it's a lower level of review, but they're still written by people who are knowledgeable in the field, and the editor, who's usually an expert in the field as well, is sort of looking it over, but it doesn't go through the same rigor or the number of reviewers as occurs in the peer-reviewed level. The next level down from peer editing is what we would call trade journals or trade magazines. Pest Control Technology, Pest Control Magazine, maybe Wildlife Control Technology. So yeah, there are things written in there by people, experts in the area, but it doesn't really go through a critical analysis. So you will find errors, especially if you're someone who's really keen on a particular area in your field. From, let's say you're the ant guy in your company and you're reading an article in some pest control related magazine, and you may find that someone says something like, well, I'm not sure that's completely true. My experience is different. Well, then that's the sort of, it may be true for that person who wrote it, but it may not have the same level of precision that a peer-reviewed article would have. And so again, we have, I'll go through that list again. We have peer-reviewed articles, we have peer-edited articles, and then we have trade magazines, trade journals. And the last level, of course, is anecdotal. This is information you get from a colleague, you may get it from your boss, you may get it from a professor, and it's all like kind of verbal. It just hasn't gone through a peer review. Your clients give you anecdotal information when they claim that the mothballs they threw underneath their deck eliminated their pest problem. Completely anecdotal. Hasn't gone through the kind of intellectual rigor. So even now, once you have that sort of grid of the types of magazines and journals that are out there, then you know that you can put more reliance on something that's in a peer-reviewed journal than you could in a trade magazine. Same way in a peer-edited proceedings has a higher credibility than something in a trade magazine. Now understand, just because it's more likely to be true doesn't mean it's always absolutely true. People are human, people make mistakes. But the higher up the editing level you go, the more the burden is on you to say that something is wrong. So because it's already been vetted. And so I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense. Now, even within each of those levels, there are going to be variations on terms of the quality. So in peer-reviewed journals, there are different quality of journals. So not all journals are the same. Even though they're all peer-reviewed, doesn't mean that they're all the same caliber. So the Journal of Wildlife Management is a premier level 1 peer-reviewed journal. Doesn't mean everything is true. It's not coming from the mouth of God, but it means that if something gets into this magazine, into this journal, you can have high confidence that that, yeah, it's probably true, or the vast majority of it is true, and you better have really good reasons to disagree with it because it's gone through the ringer. So the more you read, the more you study, you begin to recognize that certain people, when certain authors are writing, when certain people are speaking, when certain sources are being used, you're like, yeah, I can trust that. And we do this intuitively when we talk about our friends, right? When our friends tell a story, we know that some friends are better historians about something than other friends. Some friends, that fish continues to grow every time they talk. Other friends that you have, you know that when they say the fish was 12 inches long, it was 12 inches long, because different people are more precise than other people. So the same thing happens in the publication world. So learn to evaluate the sources. Don't just count the sources. Just because you can go online and you can see a lot of different things, you have to say, what is the quality of this particular source? So my bottom line here is that this particular journal has a very high reliability rating. So just to give you a little bit probably more information than you wanted to hear. But the reality is that it's certainly something that you have to consider when you're evaluating these journal articles. So it was published, again, in 1963. It's volume 27, and it starts on page 53 and following. So it's a pretty long article. So I want to kind of summarize what's in this publication for you in terms of some of the diseases, or the zoonotics. These are infectious diseases that can affect humans, and that's what this review article is. And I'm not going to talk about all the diseases that are mentioned here. Ones that you'll probably be more familiar with, and a couple that you probably won't, but it's something to keep in mind. And my point here is not to scare you. Sometimes people, when they learn about zoonotic diseases from wildlife, they use this as a scare tactic to sort of, oh, client, you have an opossum in your house. We've got to do a full-bore sterilization of your home, and at the cost of $10,000, and you have to leave and go to a hotel for 5 weeks while we're doing all this work cleaning. We need to be careful of hyping this problem. But just because some people make the mistake of hyping disease threats, other people make the mistakes of basically ignoring the disease threats. So this is not something that I want you to use as a scare tactic for your client just to make that big sale job a little bit easier because you frighten the bejesus out of your clients. Rather, this is something where I want you as the technician, you as the wildlife control operator, you as the pest control professional to be thinking about, how am I behaving to make sure that I minimize the risk of me being bitten, being scratched, coming in contact with the bodily fluids of the animals that I'm working with, and that I'm careful in the environments where those animals occur, because all of those are high risk areas that I could be exposed to an infection that I haven't thought about. So we're going to talk about universal precautions at the end of my presentation here today. So let's get started. Let's talk about some of the diseases associated with opossums. Now, you may know that the opossum is a marsupial. That is, it carries its young in a pouch, and it's like a kangaroo. It's the only marsupial we have in North America. And the scientific name of the opossum is Didelphis marsupialis. That's what an opossum is called. And so this is one of the scientific names. I think it might even have a different name today. It might be Virginianus, but I'd have to look that up again. That's one of the things that I hate about doing some scientific type work, is that the people that classify animals keep changing some of their names. And I think some of you have seen that in the insect field as well. But in any event, this particular animal is very common in the United States. Its range has expanded since the Civil War. We believe it rode along trains, and so its range has certainly increased farther from the Civil War. So it's fairly common around the U.S., less so in the north because it suffers from frostbite. But in the south, it's endemic, and it's certainly everywhere, and it's an important animal within our environment. So the first disease I'd like to talk about is called Chagas disease. That's Chagas. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's Chagas disease or Chagas disease. It comes from the kissing bug, as you know, if you've heard about this. It's a parasite that gets into our bloodstream and can cause severe health problems later on in life. It's a fairly serious parasitical disease of Central America and South America, and because it affects a large number of people, particularly those who are living in rural areas, because they're sleeping and the bug comes up and pokes them, and then people rub, and it also defecates on them. So when we rub, we push some of those feces, those infected feces, into our wound, and that is how we get infected. Well, what they're finding is that the possum can carry this particular infection inside them. So the parasite that causes Chagas disease is called Trypanosoma cruzi. That's spelled Trypanosoma, Trypanosoma cruzi, Cruzi. Now, what they found was they believe that possums are contracting this particular disease because of their association with wood rats. And so wood rats are one organism that seems to be carrying this infection. And of course, the kissing bug is associated with wood rats. We know that from some work that's being done in Colorado, where they're finding that people who had homes near wood rat infestations, wood rats are commonly called the pack rat, in that the wood rat is has these bugs nearby, and that can be a source of infection to the human. But we're now seeing, with this particular publication of 1963, is that we find that possums can be a host to this infection as well. The next category would be fungal diseases. Fungi are an important infection that we can contract. Perhaps the most common one involved in wildlife control work is histoplasmosis. This is an infection typically of the lungs. Oftentimes, people who get histoplasmosis infections think they have a cold, and they get a dry cough, and they think they have pneumonia, and then they recover, and then later on in life, when they get an x-ray, they have all this scar tissue within their lungs, because if you have a healthy immune system and you don't get a huge dose of these fungal spores, your body fights it off. The problem, however, is if you get too large of a dose, or your immune system's been weakened, then you can get what's called disseminated histoplasmosis, and that's where the fungal infection goes into other organs of the body and can cause some serious danger, where you feel weak and you feel tired. It's like you have sort of something that's seriously wrong with you over time. It's a very important infection that you need to make sure you're protecting about. This is why we're a little neurotic in our industry about the importance of HEPA filter respirators, that you never, ever go into crawl spaces, go above drop ceilings, that you're crawling around in attics without a full face, properly fitted, properly tested respirator that has HEPA filter quality on it, because of the spores that you can inhale. All it takes is one good breath and you're done for. So the fungal spores are called Histoplasma capsulatum. And so what's interesting is about the research here with possums is that they found that some possums seem to be associated with this infection. And part of the belief is, if I read it correctly here, was that there's a question as to whether the possum was actually infected with histoplasmosis, or whether the fungal spores were simply on the outside of its body. So the point is that when you're handling these animals, if you're not wearing gloves, I think you're crazy. As I tell people, you don't know where that possum has been. You don't know where that animal's been, what that animal has crawled through. So if you're grabbing that animal and you're cowboying it with your bare hands, and then you go pick your nose or bite your fingernails or something like that, you don't know what you're exposing yourself to. So keep that in the back of your mind. Let's move over to bacterial diseases. Tularemia. You might have heard of tularemia. It's often spread by horse flies and ticks. You may have heard of it as rabbit disease, where rabbit fever, where rabbits contract this particular disease. And if you can often contract it when you're skinning the rabbit, or if you haven't cooked the meat well enough. Possums can carry this bacterial infection as well, and typically it's transferred to humans through skinning of the possum, or if you get bit by the possum. So you want to be thinking about why it's important to avoid being bit or to handling bodily fluids of possums or any wild animal without appropriate protection. Leptospirosis, you may have heard of this. This is something your dog can contract by drinking contaminated water. The bacteria is called Leptospira pomona, and the possum can carry several different strains of this particular infection. So again, these are diseases that you can often get through contact, let's say with your bare hand, because you have microscopic cuts on your hand, and you can contract the infection of leptospirosis in this particular way as well. So there's a lot of different things that we can expose ourselves to when we're dealing with wildlife. How about viral diseases? Well, we have murine typhus, according to this particular publication, that we can contract. Typically, it's from the fleas that would bite the possum and carry the infection to us. So that is something, and many of you have already probably heard about how possums and the cat flea can have a relationship, and sometimes you may think, you're wondering, why does this house have a flea problem, when in fact there may have been an infestation of possums underneath the crawl space, or underneath the porch or deck, where fleas have then been coming into the house from that. How about rabies? You may have heard some people say that possums cannot contract rabies. That is simply false. Now, that being said, possums are incredibly resistant to rabies. Now, this article doesn't go into this in much depth, other than say it takes an enormous amount of virus to make a possum convert to being rabid. And the reason why many people don't have problems with possums being rabid, because they contract what's called the dumb form. Rabies expresses itself in two different ways: the dumb form or the furious form. The furious form is the one that gets all the media. That's the animal that proverbially chases you down to attack you. Very rare. I dealt with a lot of rabid animals during the Mid-Atlantic rabies epidemic. I only met a couple of animals that were in the furious phase. Most animals are going into the dumb phase. That's where the animal looks like it's injured and it's weak, and so most exposures occur by us thinking that we're going to help the animal. And so 80% of all rabies exposures from wildlife are actually human initiated. Yeah, you heard that right. It's where we are engaging the animal to try to help it, and then the animal bites us. So this is something that you want to always keep thinking about. Just because the animal looks passive, you need to make sure you're wearing your PPE, your good leather gloves, you're using cat tongs, maybe using snake tongs to grab it. You're getting some distance from this animal, you're using nets, and you're making sure that this animal at any given moment can bite you. And they can move faster than you think they can. But possums can contract rabies. They can carry it. It's very rare. The belief is that possums are eating dead or dying bats that have been infected, and then they can contract the disease that particular way. I've been emphasizing over and over and over again the importance of universal precautions. So let me kind of summarize with those universal precautions again. Commit to yourself that you will never, ever grab and handle animals or the cages without gloves. Anything is better than nothing, but ideally you want to have good leather gloves, something with some thickness to it, just in case. There's a wide variety of gloves in the market today. Pick something. Wear it religiously. I'm tired of seeing people grabbing cages with their bare hands. Have you sterilized your cage? Have you flame torched it to kill any of the little nasties that can be on it? Do you understand that animals can't leave the cage to go to the bathroom? Whenever you're grabbing an animal, making sure that you're wearing your gloves. I don't even like grabbing animals. I think you should be using a tool to do that, whether it be a cat tongs, whether it be other types of grasping devices. You want to be sure you're protecting yourself and keeping appropriate distance. Fleas can jump a distance of 4 inches. If you're going underneath the crawl space, are you wearing a Tyvek suit? What are you doing to protect yourself in case you come into a whole swarm of fleas coming at you? You don't know what those fleas could be carrying. And chances are, if you're healthy, nothing bad's going to happen to you. But a lot of times people get infections, or they feel like they have a cold or a flu. That often can be a sign of a zoonotic infection. or it just could be the flu. We have to be more careful in this business because we're exposed to things that the average public is not. So protect yourself. Learn a little bit. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to enlighten you and empower you so that you protect yourself, because if you don't have your health, you're not going to have a business. You're not going to have a job. And we want to be sure you are here to help serve your clients appropriately and well, that you're protecting them and you're protecting yourself so that you can be around to enjoy those golden years when you get retired. I'm Stephen Van Tassel for Wildlife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.